This is Dr. Dan Kahinka. Human resources has grown as a department, as a field, from early days when perhaps human resources was more about paperwork and processes and maybe getting involved in some of the hiring and maybe even some of the training practices, to where human resources in some organizations is all-inclusive, very critical part of the organization, where they're involved in everything from recruitment selection throughout the training and development and evaluation process. Again, this varies based on perhaps things like an organization size, the culture of an organization, the type of organization, all of those things. What we will go over now is the entire employment life cycle that begins with once you start recruiting employees, and then ultimately ends when employees leave an organization, and then the cycle begins again as we want to recruit and fill vacancies. Throughout this process, you will find that we also need to look at not just the types, the evidence-based solutions to these things, but then also how these things impact culture, climate, legal and ethical challenges associated with these various areas of the employment life cycle, and then also performance management, which is the process of evaluating and making sure that these areas of employment, these methods that are used in employment life cycle to recruit, select, train, that those methods are effective. So let's begin. First off, as we go through this process, we will continuously evaluate each area of the employment life cycle in great depth. Once again, including the methods that are used. We will focus on evidence-based solutions. So what are evidence-based solutions? Well, as an example, when hiring, many people think, well, when you select an individual, we are going to call up people that are interested, that apply maybe to a job advertisement. We'll interview them. Maybe we'll have a second interview face-to-face, and then ultimately hire somebody. Well, that's kind of the general hiring process. But how specifically you select candidates is extremely important. For example, and we will be going over these in great detail shortly, but for example, if you just bring someone in and you're not really prepared and one person interviews them, well, you can have bias in the interview process. You may select people based on their looks, for instance. However, if you have a structured interview where multiple people will score how people are interviewed, well, then now you can limit some of the bias and ultimately select the best candidates. So that would be an example of an evidence-based solution or an evidence-based method. That's what we are going to go over in great detail in all of these areas of the employment life cycle. Once again, we'll first begin with recruitment, then selection, training, development, and finally evaluation. So let's begin. Recruitment can be done in general internally or externally. Recruitment for many organizations, they want to first emphasize the importance of finding candidates within the organization. This, of course, varies by the size of an organization. If it's a small company, 5, 10, 20 employees, you may not have someone that you can promote or move into certain positions because there's just not enough talent to go around to fill those positions, so you may go externally. However, some companies that really emphasize the importance of recruiting internally do so for some very worthwhile reasons. For instance, by recruiting internally, you can ideally create longevity with your employees. Employees will feel more valued, they will feel more engaged in their work, and that they have opportunities within an organization. The costs associated with external recruiting as well as turnover can be rather extensive, rather expensive too. So there are many good reasons, many benefits of recruiting internally. Some of these methods of selection that I will discuss shortly will apply both to internal and external applicants. But for now, let's just look at the recruiting efforts Specifically, if you are going to, and some of these apply internally, others will apply more externally. So let's go through these. So first off, there are what I would just refer to as a broad recruitment. What that means is perhaps for larger organizations, they are looking for many employees to fill a variety of different roles. It may be actually in human resources, it may be in training, maybe in marketing, sales, research and development, all these different areas that you have within different organizations. And so maybe more of a broad recruiting effort. You will find these at times, for instance, maybe at high schools, trade schools, colleges, where organizations will go in and just advertise their organization, say, hey, come work for us. And when individuals become interested in an organization, then in turn they will begin to look at the various jobs that may be available within the organization and maybe where they would best fit. And the same with the company. They will look at where this potential recruit will best fit. That's an example of what I would refer to as more of a broad recruitment effort. Now, when you have high turnover in an organization, then you may have a somewhat more targeted type of recruitment effort, but still somewhat broad. Let me explain. If you have, let's say, a manufacturing organization that has jobs that are just maybe not attractive to many people, they may be highly labor intensive, they may not pay as much as other jobs. Therefore, what ends up happening is you have a high turnover. And so at times, specifically in an area like manufacturing, maybe distribution, where you have daily quotas that need to be met, you have orders that need to be filled, you just need to get people into these positions to do them. Perhaps they're very low skilled, so the amount of time it takes to train these individuals is very short, and you just want bodies in there. So what you do in that case is you may have like I said, a somewhat targeted type of hiring, meaning that for instance, that maybe it's high school students or people just beginning college or people at the beginning of their careers that have just graduated, or maybe they haven't graduated and they need work to support their families. So this might be a target group that you're looking for. Individuals that are more advanced in their careers may not want to do jobs like this. So you're somewhat targeted in the people, although the positions, it may not matter what position they go in so much, because they're mainly entry level, easy to train, and who knows, maybe even during the selection process is where you identify people that might, let's say, gravitate more towards one job versus another. As an example, maybe you have a job that's very physical. It involves a lot of manual labor versus another job. Perhaps it's working on the computer more, working on telephones, talking to people, customer service type job. Well, you may have an applicant comes in that would fit in one job or the other, or they may want to work one job or another. Now, another form of recruiting is technical. In this case, it may be jobs that are ranging from engineering type jobs, building, contracting, plumbing, all sorts of jobs like that require certain technical skills. For these type of jobs, the recruitment effort also may be much more targeted. As an example, if organizations are looking for plumbers, builders, perhaps truck drivers, maybe individuals that are engineers or good at mathematics, so perhaps for finance. These various individuals, because of their type of training that's needed, some of the recruitment efforts may seek out trade schools, different types of specialization type schools where individuals are trained to get certificates, licensing, that stuff. Maybe the colleges where individuals are getting certain degrees that are required, such as maybe a teaching degree, engineering degree, art degree, some of those different things that you want to find people that have certain very technical skills. So those recruitment efforts may go out to those types of organizations. And then finally, specific jobs. This may be for lower level positions. In other words, you may need individuals that have a certain, let's say, a license, like a forklift operator, a backhoe operator. It could be that it's someone that's working on mortgage refinancing or financing, I should say. So they have to have certain knowledge in the banking industry. It may be a nurse or a doctor, someone with very specific skills that fit a very specific role. All the way up to CEOs, chief financial officers, chief executive officers, those individuals that have a lot of talent that is very specialized. So it might be, let's say, the CEO of a major hospital. What happens now is the recruitment efforts are much more targeted, and it may be that a human resources department needs to seek out a service to help them find these individuals. Now, how does, in the employment life cycle, how do these various areas that I mentioned before, from performance management to legal and ethical challenges, how are they associated with recruitment? So let's go over each one. First off, performance management. What Human Resources Department wants to look at is, are they being successful? In other words, one way they can look at that is in the recruitment process, is the methods they're using, are they getting enough people? Are they getting enough people to apply for the jobs? Or are they just getting a very limited number so most anyone that applies will get the job? That would be a case in a high turnover example, where you really have no choice. Your recruitment efforts are just getting bodies in, and whoever comes in wants the job gets the job. One might argue that if you're from a performance management standpoint, that is not a highly effective recruitment effort. More bodies need to be brought in. So now, to some degree, the selection process can take over and determine who may be a better fit than others in that process. Climate and culture are also impacted by the recruitment effort. I mentioned earlier that the selection process may incorporate internal hiring. The company may focus internally first. This can have a huge impact on both climate and culture. Climate, again, can be is more, just to better understand climate, is more short term. It can perhaps change by the hour, day, week, month, year. As an example, if an organization, let's say, never hires internally, and whenever a position becomes available, they immediately will go and advertise externally for someone to be brought in, that can have a negative impact on the climate, or if a new position becomes available, people internally want the position, but they are not part of that recruitment effort. You can make individuals very upset, and who knows, maybe they'll even leave because they figure, well, we do not have any sort of opportunities here. Now, culture would be more like, that's more stable, that's more long-term. In this example, where culture would perhaps impact recruitment is it may be a culture of internal hiring. In other words, the culture prides itself, the organization prides itself, the leadership prides itself on looking first within the organization to see if people want a different job, if they desire it, maybe because the work hours are more flexible, the pay is better, there's more opportunities for leadership, those types of things. And then finally, legal and ethical challenges associated with the recruitment process. Legal challenges, it may be that if you are advertising, let's say, for certain jobs, and I'll discuss this in much greater detail when we get into the selection process. But if you're advertising for certain jobs and a highly effective job analysis has not been performed, you may be asking for skills and criteria associated with the job that is not valid. So let me explain that in great detail here. First off, a job analysis should be done before the recruitment process begins. What a job analysis is, specifically if you're using an evidence-based approach, is you look at a job very carefully and validate the skills and abilities that are associated with that job. In other words, you will observe, interview people that do the job, look at challenges associated with the job, look at all of the different things involved in the job, so that way when you finally go out and want to advertise the job and you have a job description for that, everything on that job description actually applies to the job. If it doesn't, in other words, it's not a valid predictor of performance, then there may be some legal consequences. As an example, if a job on a job application states job applicants must be able to lift 50 pounds. However, if you look carefully at the job, you realize that actually equipment is primarily used to lift items. And when larger items are actually lifted by hand, then perhaps for safety reasons, multiple people will always do this. Well, what that means is you don't actually have to lift 50 pounds as an individual. So if you have job applicants, if you're recruiting people and you tell them, listen, you have to lift 50 pounds, and maybe someone does not have the physical ability to do that, they get refused, that could be reasons for potential lawsuit. That could be maybe even not a lawsuit, but maybe even just a bad image that's created for that organization because they're turning away people that otherwise could do the job. And then finally, of course, if it's a high turnover environment and you're turning away people that actually could do the job and you're turning them away because that job description is not accurate, well, that's also not good for the organization. It is, again, in summary, it's extremely important to have an effective job analysis performed before the recruitment effort starts. If an effective job analysis is performed, then that will decrease the amount of legal challenges that could be made. And then, of course, that's more ethical, arguably. And yes, I understand ethics are somewhat relative depending on the organization, the people, the culture, the country, wherever ethics may vary in considering what is ethical or not. But for the most part, one might argue that if something is illegal, it also may be also unethical. That's where it's so important to have a process of recruitment that really looks carefully at the job and making sure that you are out there recruiting people with an effective job description. Now, let's discuss that in more detail in the selection process. Now, when it comes to selection, and I'll talk about, since I just got done talking about legal and ethical, let me go into that in some more detail now before I go into the different types of selection. During selection process, this is where people will really begin to better understand perhaps why they never got a job. That is, so during the recruitment effort, if someone doesn't get, let's say, a phone call back, they may never know the reason and they move on and look for another job. But once people begin to, they're starting to be interviewed, now all of a sudden, if they do not get selected for a job, let's go back to our previous example, if they do not get selected for a job because it may appear that, let's say they had to actually try to lift 50 pounds. That's something that's done at many organizations where you have to demonstrate that you are capable of doing something like that, and then they're not hired. Well, now, because they will be able to figure out if they did not get that job because they could not lift that weight. However, if lifting that amount of weight is actually not even performed on the job, in other words, it's not a valid predictor of performance, now that could really be a case where an individual could sue an organization, and they have. There's a lengthy history in America of individuals suing organizations because when they selected individuals, or more importantly, when they did not select them, they were not selected for reasons that were just simply they weren't valid predictors of performance. All right, so let's now talk about how you avoid some of these challenges. Now, what types of selection methods are there? I have a few examples here for you, and there are others, but here's a few examples. First off, the typical, traditional, if you will, phone interview. Phone interview, person could also perhaps, it may be over the internet, using some sort of software over the internet. There's various types. of course, but essentially it's that first interview that an individual many times gets. It's their first communication with an organization. Uh, a regular phone interview, in other words, where it might be, let's say, a human resource professional or a hiring manager calling up and scheduling some time and talking to someone, that in and of itself is not an evidence-based approach. Because if the questions that are asked vary from one person to the next, well, now what happens is you're not giving sort of an equitable or an equal opportunity for all those employees. And what may end up happening is you may lose some of the better employees because maybe you asked them more difficult questions and it didn't appear that they did as well, versus another employee, maybe you asked easier questions and they did really well, so you select that employee. That is a reason why you want to have a structured approach. In my experience, one of the better approaches that I had was where an organization had, first off, a structured phone interview. So they asked everyone, all the candidates, the exact same questions. And they also then, in turn, recorded that conversation. And the recording was played to multiple people. What ended up happening, therefore, is the person actually doing the interview, they did not have any sort of feedback that was given what they thought of the candidate. They just simply did the interview. Then the recording was interviewed by people that were experts on the job and scored the people that they listened to on the recording. Now what you had occur here is bias was very controlled. Because let's say, imagine you had 3 people that all listened to this recording. They used some sort of score sheet, and all 3 of those scores were maybe averaged out or compared with each other, and then in turn they selected the best candidates that would move on in the interview process as a result. You can see how this process can help control bias, so now you are not selecting people that may not be qualified for the job or kicking out people that could have been really great candidates. After a phone interview, and this is a similar example as the phone interview, but a structured interview. So similarly, where that phone interview was more structured, the actual interview, whether it be virtual or at the organization where it's a face-to-face environment, just a regular interview like I described before, where different questions are asked of different candidates, can lead to problems. Therefore, a structured interview can be much more effective. Here again, you may have where you have a score sheet of some sort as a human resource department, and people travel around from one person to another. Maybe it takes all morning, or so it's more cost effective, it's a group interview where maybe there's 3, 4, 5 people on a panel and they're all interviewing candidates and then scoring them. They all have pre-planned questions, so that way they ask the identical questions of each candidate. Another very effective and popular form of assessment during the interview process would be various forms of testing. It could be cognitive tests, skills tests, testing for various skills and tasks that are done on the job, or different types of personality characteristics that one looks for. As an example, servant leadership. Let's say you have a culture that wants to hire people that they think of others first. They're more giving. They're more spiritual. They're more caring of their communities. They're perhaps more willing to forgive and forget, and all these various characteristics that are associated with servant leaders, which makes a very highly productive, effective culture. Well, if that's the people that you want to hire, then part of the interview process could be using an assessment that measures levels of servant leadership characteristics. There are many different types of assessments out there. It could be emotional intelligence, could be IQ, could be on and on, various leadership assessments, various other personality characteristics like extroversion or introversion. It could be that you're looking for ability to cope with stress. Maybe it's, let's say, in an electric company or a nuclear facility where perhaps there can be very stressful moments, and you want to make sure that the people that you're hiring have an ability to cope with stress. So it could be various cognitive type tests like that. Now, during the selection process, as I mentioned previously, human resource wants to look not just, they want to design a selection process that's highly effective, but at the same time they evaluate that design and make sure people that are doing what's planned are doing what they should be doing in the best ways. For example, when we are evaluating the performance, when we're managing the performance of people that are doing interviews, well, we want to make sure that structured interviews are actually being applied and done so in the appropriate way. So it may be not, you don't just have people actually doing an interview that's structured, but also you have a human resource professional that's evaluating the people doing the interviewing, making sure that they are doing what needs to be done. That's how performance management can impact the selection process. Now, climate and culture. Here again, the selection process can impact climate and culture in a number of ways. First off, as we mentioned before, if you are selecting people internally for jobs, then it can impact the climate in positive ways because people are getting the jobs, within their organization rather than hiring someone externally. But keep in mind, that's assuming that evidence-based approaches are being used. Imagine you have two candidates that are applying for a job, both internally, and one is selected, however, an evidence-based solution is not used. Maybe the person that's selected they were selected because they were friends with someone. Maybe they had a political connection or something where they were selected. Well, now that can negatively impact the climate of the organization because what ends up happening is the other person that wasn't selected, they will get upset, they will get mad perhaps. They may tell other people, hey, look, I'm the most qualified, but I wasn't selected for the job. That is how climate can be impacted in the selection process. Also, culture. If you have a culture, here again, where internal candidates are prioritized over external candidates, then the culture can also be a much more positive, effective culture within an organization, where the people within the organization that already have a job there have more of an opportunity because they have the first chance, if you will, to demonstrate they can do a job before you seek external candidates. Finally, you have legal and ethical challenges associated with selection that are fairly significant. I mentioned previously that a job analysis needs to be done to make sure that whatever tasks, skills, personality characteristics, all of these things that we're looking at in job candidates, we want to make sure that they are effective predictors of performance. They are valid predictors of performance. Because if they are not, then as people get excluded from the hiring process, in other words, they're turned down, they are not hired, then if there was predictors of performance that were not valid and if the processes weren't reliable and the best candidate was actually turned away, then that could lead to a variety of legal and ethical issues. Now, we've just gone through the recruitment and the selection process. Now let's transition to training. This is where now the best individual has been hired for the job, and we now want to get this individual trained or individuals trained and working as soon as possible, so that way they are earning their keep, if you will. They're earning the money that we are paying them. This process for many organizations, the process of training begins with traditionally is an orientation. In other words, imagine it's the first day that an individual starts a job, and they perhaps either by themselves or with a large group of people, if it's a situation where As I mentioned before, it's high turnover. You have lots of bodies coming in to fill different jobs. It's a big organization. So you have this orientation where you are now teaching employees information that's critical for their performance on the job. This is where many companies begin the process of working with employees in a manner that may not be as effective as they would like. Here's what I mean by that. Is when you first bring in employees, many companies have a lengthy orientation process where they go over all sorts of information that many of the employees will simply not remember. Imagine the first time that you had a job, you were probably nervous. You were looking around the room, seeing who else is being hired. All sorts of distractions are occurring when you're going through this orientation process. Because of all those distractions, you may not remember a significant amount of information that's being explained to you. An evidence-based approach to an orientation might look something like this. Imagine now you have a relatively short orientation. In other words, going over specific critical information that's needed to be safe on the job. As an example, if it's a manufacturing facility, you do not want someone going out on that manufacturing floor without knowing critical information so they don't get hurt on the first day. That is information that we would deem as being critical to the orientation process. Now, what might not be critical is, for instance, going over benefits of the job. That occurs many times on first day, where they talk about health care and life insurance or days off, break time, lunch time, all those different things, when they're not necessarily critical for performance on the job. A lot of that stuff they can learn throughout the next, let's say, few weeks or months on the job. Some of that information they can just learn from their fellow coworkers. So in other words, if their fellow coworker says, hey, it's time for our break, time to go eat some lunch, well, they're going to know then when they should go on lunch, right? So when I was responsible for a training program at a distribution center, what used to be, as an example, orientation that lasted most of the day, I was able to take that orientation program and make it so it lasted only about an hour or two. And after that hour or two, the employees knew what was critical on the job. We also went through the basics of their job, so they, in turn, before they even went on their first break practically, they were able to go ahead and start doing the job they were hired for. Yes, keep in mind this varies based on the type of job. That was for an entry-level type of position. It may change based on the various positions, but the concept, if you will, remains the same. Even for high-level positions, very technical positions, it may be that you have a short orientation and let the person start doing their job sooner than later. Now what ends up happening is they can begin to learn in other ways. They begin to learn on their own. They begin to apply that. Now what that has to do, what I'd like to discuss and further about that is pedagogy and andragogy. What is that? Well, pedagogy is the way people learn. Andragogy is the way adults learn. If you understand both of these concepts, then you will understand why I would tell you that a long orientation is not very effective, because you have all the distractions, plus people begin naturally, when you're training them or teaching them, they begin to stop listening. They begin to get distracted. Even for this recording that you're watching right now, I've been talking for a very long time, you begin to get distracted. The good thing about a recording like this is you can stop it, go do something, come back, and begin to watch it again, right? So I have to get a certain amount of information out here. But if this was a live setting and I was teaching you all these things, I already would have had multiple activities. I would have had you repeat information. I'd perhaps have you work together. I might have you write down some things. I might have you come up and teach some of this stuff yourself. All of these various techniques are shown to be much more effective at training people. I would argue that first and foremost, trainers need to be very aware of the techniques used that are based on pedagogy, andragogy, based on those principles. Because if they are, then people will learn more, quicker, they'll be more effective, and it becomes obviously more cost effective, which we'll go over next. So the cost versus reward. In other words, if you have a high turnover environment, it is not a cost effective to have a orientation process that might last a day or two. It's high turnover. We want to get people working as soon as possible. However, if it's, remember, I talked early on about a very strategic type of specific hiring process where you're hiring someone very technical and they have very specific skills, maybe they're much higher paid. Well, that's where perhaps the orientation process may take longer. We still use these principles of training, pedagogy, andragogy principles, but we do it in just a little bit different way. So in other words, maybe it's not as much where they're actually doing their job, but maybe they're working with all sorts of different people and they're getting to know people, making more friends, learning about the overall organization, spending time in different strategic areas, things of that nature before they actually start doing their job. So these examples I'm providing you, you always must consider the type of organization and all these other factors associated with the job. Different types of training may include tasks where you're learning, such as, again, when I was teaching people in the distribution center, it may have been teaching them how to operate a piece of equipment. So various tasks like that. We also want to, during the training process, teach people about legal requirements and safe, things associated, let's say, with safety, like I mentioned before. And then eventually it may be where we want to talk to them more about benefits and pay and some of this information, so that way we want to keep them, right? We just hired them. We spent a lot of money going through the recruitment and selection process, so we want to do some things to make sure they're excited about being at the job in the beginning, they have a positive experience, and they stick around. Finally, there are many practical challenges associated with the training process. It may very well be that you don't have that much, the budget, let's say, is not that high for the training department or the people doing the training. They just don't have that much money to pay for what they need to do. So you're much more limited. It may be that because of that, you have limited equipment, limited technical equipment, limited space, all sorts of limitations put on you because of a practical challenge, such as how much money was allocated towards the training process. Other practical challenges may be the building itself. Maybe it's just a small building to get things done, so it's hard to conduct training in any sort of private environment. All sorts of reasons can contribute to the various practical challenges associated with training. Now, again, let's talk about performance management, climate culture, how these are impacted by training and impact training. So in other words, performance management. Human resources will want to pay close attention to the training process to make sure it is effective. Example would be in that high turnover environment, human resources, when they're looking at performance management of the training process, they want to make sure that those employees are being productive, maintaining high quality, all of those things associated with their specific jobs, and doing so in a timely manner. That's where performance management comes into play. We want to make sure that that training process is effective, and if it is effective, is it being as effective as it could be? What I mean by that is some companies are satisfied with how effective, in this case, a training program may be, and they're satisfied with the levels of performance. But what they may not understand is there may be a lot more opportunity for much higher levels of performance. For example, at an organization where I was the director of operations, what we found was once we created a rewards program that was based on production associated with their pay, in other words, the more they produced, assuming we had quality involved in that as well. So in other words, they had to maintain high quality, but if they performed more, they got paid more. All of a sudden, we saw numbers that we never would have dreamed that we would have seen otherwise. No one produced nearly as much, but once we found that key way of training people and then rewarding them, we found that production dramatically improved. Climate and culture. Here again, imagine if you have an organization that does not have an effective training program. People get frustrated, they don't know how to do their jobs. In the example I was describing previously, maybe they're not making as much money as they could because they're not being properly trained. That can have a dramatic impact on the climate where people are just not happy in the organization. Whereas that climate could be dramatically changed rather quickly. That's a feature of climate, is it can change rapidly if, for instance, all of a sudden we create a new training program where now we really focus on individuals. And this will translate into, once we start talking about development as well, about working with people and making sure that they're effective on the job. Culture is similar to climate in this example, where if you have a culture that, let's say, heavily emphasizes training, then that'll, of course, dramatically impact climate because your culture is based on your rules, your leadership, your pay, your rewards, all of that, even the budget values the training process of individuals. There's more money allocated towards training. That's the culture. And so that, of course, can dramatically impact climate because people are happier at the organization. They feel more valued and they feel like they're growing as individuals because they're being better trained. Let's transition now into development. Part of what we discussed in when it came to training applies also to development. In other words, how people learn, pedagogy, andragogy, as well as rewards that are given for perhaps as you're being developed. And one of the best rewards perhaps many people can think of when they are properly developed and become better at their jobs and maybe they become better managers, better leaders, they get promoted. So that's one of the best rewards many times people can think of when it comes to development. The difference between development and training may be that you kind of consider training as more leaning towards the beginning of this employment life cycle, whereas development is perhaps more ongoing. In other words, people have now been trained on how to do their jobs, they've been trained on the safety, the human resource benefits, all that other stuff. Now they're being developed. They're being, in other words, you might describe it as being prepared for other jobs in the organization, higher level jobs. They're being prepared for promotion. Succession planning that's related to development. In other words, succession planning, what that is making sure that you have people that are trained and developed and ready to fill a position for when someone retires, quits, gets fired, moves into a different position because for whatever reason. So this development process is critical to succession planning. And it may have to do with training on new skills. Some evidence-based approaches to development might be cross-training, for instance, where you are partnered up. Perhaps you get a mentor that's in a specific role and you learn from them. It could be behavioral-based. In other words, let's say you have individuals that are not the best communicators. Now you want to, and because of poor communication, they have just some behavior that's just rather negative, the way they're treating other people. So you may have specific types of development programs available where people can become better communicators. Maybe I worked at one organization where I taught classes on attitude. So in other words, people had a better attitude. Once they came out of those classes, they better understood how if they had a negative attitude, how it could impact others, or how other people's negative attitudes could impact them. So that's more of like a behavioral, more of an intrinsic type of training process. As we look at performance management, similar to the other areas that we talked about already, we want to make sure that these development efforts are being in place. We want to make sure that managers and other individuals within the organization are properly developing people, members of their teams. Because if they're not, if it's a culture of development, now that culture is not being followed. People are not being properly developed like the leadership that developed the culture of the organization planned them to be. And if they're not properly being developed, that can impact a climate. People can feel negative, they don't feel engaged in their jobs, and lack of engagement can lead to all sorts of problematic behaviors, including absenteeism, uh, different types of negative behaviors at the workplace, such as arguing with others, leading all the way up to high turnover rates. Legal and ethical challenges associated with development. Similar to selection, we want to make sure that the processes are fair and equitable, meaning we are not selecting people because of their gender, for instance, which could be problematic, because if we're just selecting, for instance, people of one gender and not the other, that is not a fair and equitable process. That could lead to legal challenges. It's also, one could argue, not ethical. We want to give everyone a fair and equitable opportunity to get promoted and get developed and be part of these various development programs. If you look at the organization, that is much more effective to have an ethical legal approach to development and create a fair, equitable process, because then you are now selecting people that are best suited for the jobs. They're not selected because of their looks or some other reason. Finally, we have evaluation. Similar to performance management, which looks at the processes of the employment life cycle, evaluation is now amongst the individuals that are filling these positions. Evaluation may begin from the very first day that a person is hired and lead all the way through their entire employment life cycle, meaning until the day that they leave employment because, once again, because they retire or whatever reasons. When it comes to evidence-based solutions to evaluation, one of the most popular forms of an evidence-based solution evaluation would be multi-rater feedback. You can have, for instance, self-evaluation, where I evaluate myself, my manager looks at my self-evaluation, and we work out areas that I can improve on based on my own self-evaluation. However, that is biased based on my perspective. I may not see problems that others see. Therefore, my boss also evaluates my performance. Now we are slowly entering this multi-rater feedback, because now we have two raters. The person doing the rating may also seek out my coworkers and ask them about my performance, or perhaps the customers, perhaps vendors, people that I'm purchasing products from or something like that and interacting with. Now you get multiple perspectives on my performance. That is a multi-rater approach. And if it's done in a scientific manner, in other words, looking at what valid predictors are performance and all sorts of other things that we can talk about another day, as long as it's a valid, reliable process, a multi-rater approach to evaluation can be highly effective. I also want to mention frequency and rewards, meaning the frequency of the evaluation process is also very important. Many times I've worked for organizations where I was evaluated once a year, and then I never had any form of evaluation for the rest of the year. That can be very frustrating, because once you get evaluated, then you forget about it for 11 months, and then you think, oh, my evaluation's coming up soon, I better start doing better. So frequency matters. It may very well be that a more evidence-based approach would involve a more regular form of evaluation. Even weekly, let's say simple types of evaluation, to more complex evaluation every quarter, to maybe the most complex, like a multi-rater system once a year. And rewards. We want to make sure when people are evaluated that it's not just there are not just negative reasons for, let's say, getting bad evaluations. In other words, you may, let's say, lose some pay or all the way up to termination, but there are positive rewards associated with your evaluation process. It might be more pay, or more importantly, other areas that are more intrinsic. In other words, time off to spend with family, maybe a more flexible job, whatever it may be. But it is very important to have not just some form of negative result of a bad evaluation, but positive reinforcement for a good evaluation. The climate, the culture, of course, both of those can be impacted by the evaluation process. And then when it comes to legal and ethical challenges, perhaps one area to look at here is as you're evaluating people, you want to make sure, once again, you hear me say this several times, a fair, equitable process. So that way the person or people doing the evaluating are not biased, let's say, against someone. Maybe someone is just not a likable person, but they are very effective on their job. Well, if you're evaluating because they're not likable, but that has nothing to do with their performance, then that would be a biased evaluation process if being likable had nothing to do with their performance or other people's performance. So we want to make sure that it's a reliable, valid process of evaluation to avoid any sort of legal, ethical challenges. In review, what we've discussed here is the entire employment life cycle. We've gone through from the beginning when an individual is first recruited and then selected. Finally, they're trained, developed, and evaluated. And during this employment life cycle, we also, of course, must consider how we manage the performance of the people doing these tasks. We need to look at the various HR professionals as well as the other managers, direct reports, other employees, co-workers, to make sure that they are doing all of these things appropriately, so that way we meet the highest standards of the organization. And then in turn, we are also performing these various methods I've discussed legally in an ethical manner. I hope you learned a lot about the employment life cycle today and the various components associated with the employment life cycle. And I want to thank you very much. And I just wish you a very happy and blessed day. Thank you. This is Dr. Dan, and I wish you the best.